how many villagers do you think have died in your world? Probably a lot, right? Now, imagine if you could see the souls of every single one of them. Well, that was the unbreakable curse of Minecraft's Death Villager. So, here's his story. It was raining on that morning, and the villagers were all staying inside within their sheltered houses. And nothing was too out of the ordinary when suddenly a group of evil pillagers emerged and began raiding the village. Now normally they would just burn down the houses within the village to kill all the villagers, but with the current downpour those fires wouldn't spread, and so they had to do something else. And well, what they did was just ruthless, as they would break down the doors of each individual house and murder the villagers within their own homes. And so hundreds of villagers were killed in just minutes. And so many villagers even tried hiding within their houses, but none would stay hidden for long enough. But then there was this one villager, and his name was D. And he, seeing that all of his friends were being killed within their own homes, knew that he couldn't stay within his. But he also knew that running outside was a death trap, as the pillagers will see him, and he'll likely be killed instantly. But still, if he ran outside, there was a chance that he could escape to safety. And so he made the split-second decision that he was going to try and run away. And so he waited for a minute until the pillagers were in the house next door when he made his move. And so he ran out of his house and into the stable nearby and mounted the closest horse that he could see and began making his getaway. A few pillagers saw him and they began shooting at him, but luckily the horse that he found was going too fast, and so he was able to get to safety away from all the pillagers. But later he had another problem, as it was going to be night soon and monsters would start spawning, and he had nothing to defend himself with, so he needed to find shelter before that happened. But he couldn't see any villagers anywhere nearby, and so that's when he had an idea, as seeing there was a mountain nearby, he thought that maybe he could climb it using his horse, and hopefully on the top of the mountain he would have a better lookout over the area. And so that's exactly what he did, as he was able to scale the mountain quite quickly through the use of his horse's impressive jumping skills. But he wasn't quick enough, as it began to snow on that mountain and it was quickly arriving to night. Luckily, he reached the summit and he didn't see any villagers. This was bad. Monsters were going to start spawning soon and he had nowhere to go, and it was getting colder and colder, so he was going to start freezing soon. But he just didn't know what to do. He was going to die now, but just as all hope seemed lost, he spotted something in the distance. It was an outpost. It looked abandoned. This was risky, but this could be his only hope. The cold was killing him. He needed to get to shelter, and so he jumped back on his horse and went down the slopes of the mountain and made his way to the abandoned outpost, just hoping that there were no pillagers inside. And so he demounted his horse and carefully made his way inside. Luckily, it looked safe, as there were no signs of any pillagers anywhere near here. In fact, it looked as if this outpost had been abandoned for a number of decades. And so he set up his bed right in the center of the outpost so that he was the most shielded from the cold, and then went to sleep for the night. And so it was later that next morning when he was just packing up his bed from the outpost, ready to go looking for a new village to move to, when he heard something. It was coming from under the floorboards. That was odd. And well, seeing as he wasn't in any danger anymore, he decided to uncover what that mysterious sound was. And well, he was shocked at what he saw, as he just found some stairs leading downwards. And so, curious, he jumped down to them and followed them downwards. It was quite dark, but there were some dim redstone lights so he could see roughly where he needed to go. And so he continued going further and further down this tiny stairway, when he came across a room. It was large, but still very dark, so he couldn't see much of it other than the areas that were illuminated by the redstone torches. But there was one thing in this room that stood out, as right in the center there was a giant totem of Undying, floating above an emerald pedestal. He had never seen a totem in person, but had always been told about them and their amazing immortality powers. And so, thinking that he may be able to get a totem of Undying out of this, he tried jumping over to it to touch this legendary artifact, when suddenly the entire room lit up in red and a repetitive drumbeat started playing. It was getting louder and louder and louder, and then the totem of Undying began floating into the air and green orbs began flowing out of it. Dee stayed still, watching all this in awe. But as he felt as if the totem of Undying was calling out to him. And so, once again, he began walking closer to it, when suddenly he was struck with bolts of lightning repeatedly, over and over and over, and he was now burning. The lightning was killing him. He was going to die. Why did he do this? Why did he come down here? This was all a mistake. And so he began to black out. Was this his end? Luckily, it wasn't, as a few hours later, he woke up. But when he woke up, he was in immense pain. But at least he was still alive. However, at that moment, he couldn't see anything around him, as the room had become much darker than before, as all the redstone lights, he assumed, had been deactivated. And so, to make his way out of this room, he cautiously walked around, feeling to see if he could find the walls. And once he had, he then felt around to try and find the stairs. And then once he found the stairs, he began to make his way out, underground ritual room, and into the abandoned outpost. But still, something was wrong, as he still couldn't see anything, yet he could feel the warmth of the sun. So he was definitely outside. Something must be very, very wrong. And well, that was because his eyes had actually melted away, and all that remained were red eye sockets. But thankfully, he didn't know that yet. He just thought that maybe the lightning strikes were so bright that they temporarily blinded him, and that's why he thought he couldn't see. And so, thinking that, he thought that he needed to go and find a village where other villagers could help him and stop this effect of blindness from becoming permanent. And so he called out for his horse and mounted it and began riding away from the abandoned outpost, now on the search for the sounds of a village. But several hours passed and he couldn't hear any villagers. It was very strange. He should have found one by now, as he was travelling very quickly through the use of his horse. But what he found later instead was far more strange, as he had just found the village where he had originally fled from. And so really, he should have continued to see nothing, as he didn't have any eyes, right? Well, no, as he could see the villagers, or so he thought. And so he ran over to them, but as he got closer and closer to those villagers, it became clear that they were not just villagers. Instead, they were the souls of the villagers that had died in that raid. And so he goes up to one and talks to it.
What are you?
Dead.
And the ghost just vanished. And so he walked up to another.
What did we do to deserve this? Please help. How did you survive?
All the spirits just vanished after speaking, and Dee was traumatized. These were his closest friends, and he could clearly see that they were suffering, even in death. But more than just being traumatized, he was confused, as how was he seeing the souls of the dead? But luckily he knew exactly who to ask for the answer of that question. And that was the villager priest. And so he ran into the village castle, and his spirit was there. This was good. He could ask him all about this. And so he walked up to him and told him what had happened.
Well, D, you have very luckily or unluckily, depending on how you look at it, have wandered your way into a dark magic ritual, which I believe has allowed you to see all dead villagers. However, the cost of gaining this great power is the loss of ordinary vision. But luckily that shouldn't matter in the long term. So all I have left to say is to use this power wisely. Good luck.
And then he disappeared too. Dee was shocked at what he said, as he had never heard in his entire life about any dark magic rituals, but at least he now understood that he was blind. But on the plus side, he could see souls, which sounded quite useful. But one thing he didn't understand was what using his powers wisely would have meant. And so quickly, he just assumed that wisely meant that he had the duty of sharing this power any other villagers that he could find. And so thinking that, he got back onto his horse and began traveling again. And it took him a few days, but he did eventually find a village. And so he demounted his horse and told everyone about his story. And everyone in that village thought he was lying, as they all thought that he was just telling them some sort of crazy story to get emeralds out of pity, because he was blind with no eyes after all. And so with both of these factors, all the villagers just stared at him blankly, and some even offered to help heal his eye wounds if he just said the truth. But then one young villager stood forward and gave Dee the chance of redemption.
Prove it. My parents both drowned in that lake over there. So go over there and talk to them.
The villagers all just stared at Dee.
Okay then, so I will.
And so Dee, followed by all the other villagers, walked over to the lake. And Dee, in his soul vision, could see two villagers floating in that lake. And so he began swimming out to them. But still, all the villagers stood there, watching him in anticipation, waiting to see what he had to say, when he began shouting out facts.
They were in a mangrove boat.
That was true. They had sailed out just over 2 weeks ago, fishing for cod.
They died 2 weeks, 4 hours, and 24 minutes ago.
That sounds right.
Their names were Jerry and Subscriber Third.
That was also true.
They lived in that house over there.
And how did he know that as well? All the villagers were amazed, and there was no doubt now that Villager D was telling the truth, as there was just no way that he could know all of these facts without talking to the dead. And so they all began calling out to him so that D would know where to get out of the lake. And then once he was out of the lake, they all began begging him to talk to other deceased villagers so that they could talk to their dead friends. And he did all that they asked and was rewarded greatly for it, as many gave him emeralds as rewards. In fact, he did this so often for so many villagers that news spread of his powers, and soon every villager in the overworld knew about him, and they all called him the Death Villager, as he was the only known villager in all of history that could ever talk to the dead. And so soon he became very wealthy, and with some of his wealth he even had a large mansion built out in the woods, where he would live in solitude and luxury, with only the dead keeping him company. And so life was great for the Death Villager, as he was just happy, as he was using his powers wisely, just as the priest told him to do, and was becoming very rich. But this life of his would all come crashing down as quickly as he created it. As it turns out, that abandoned outpost wasn't really abandoned, as it was actually a secret laboratory for an evil evoker who specialized in necromancy. And he had been gone for a few days looking for a spyglass, which was the final ingredient he needed to have the perfect communication with the dead, when Dee walked into his laboratory and became the Death Villager by activating the spell that he had spent the last 50 years preparing. And so when the evoker returned to his laboratory, he was furious that someone would have activated the spell that he had spent so long preparing. However, for the first 3 months after that point, he didn't know who to get angry with, as he had no idea who activated that spell. But that changed when one day, whilst still very angry, a close pillager friend of his ran up to him and told him about the legendary Death Villager. At that moment, that he knew that that villager was the one that activated his spell, as no villager would be able to cast that spell. That Death Villager must have been the one who did this. And so that evil evoker gathered a brigade of pillagers, and they all began marching towards the Death Villager's mansion. And on their way, they would kill any villager that they would come across. And using some basic magic, they would send them the following message.
Hello, Dead Villager. You were killed because one of your kind stole something from me, and your death is my revenge against him. The villager that you should blame for all of this is called the Death Villager, and if you want to get your revenge on him, you must follow me, and together we will.
And so they marched onwards for a few days, killing thousands of villagers, giving them all that same message. And so they were bringing with them thousands of souls. And when they arrived at the entrance of the Death Villager's mansion, they opened the doors and allowed the souls to torment the Death Villager.
They killed us because they wanted you. You are the reason we died. It's all your fault. We suffer because of your death.
To everyone serving the Death Villager, nothing seemed wrong. But to the Death Villager, well, he was shaking in fear as someone out thousands of souls that only he could see surrounding him, yelling at him. And he felt terrible for all of this. He didn't want this. He just wanted to help villagers talk to the dead. And he never meant to activate that spell in the outpost. And then the lead evoker arrived in the mansion, and he ran over to the Death Villager.
Now, you can join them, you thief.
And so, he was killed. Or so they all thought, as he was somehow teleported to a mountain peak and was safe. That totem inside him must have saved him. Maybe there was more to that dark magic ritual beyond just seeing the dead. Maybe he was beyond death and was immortal now. Maybe. But as he was thinking that, he looked up and saw a black present. That was odd. He hadn't seen any blocks since that ritual turned him into the Death Villager. And so confused, he walked over to it and picked it up, when a dark, red-cloaked being jumped out from it and yelled,
Finally, I have returned. Wait, who are you?
The cloaked being leapt towards the Death Villager and punched him, which killed him instantly. So, I guess he wasn't able to beat death after all. But still, who was that? And why could the Death Villager see him? Well, to find that out, you'll need to watch this video.